Okay, so a little while back I did a video where I covered 3 of the best Game Master sections that I've ever come across in RPGs. The premise was that people who read and play lots of RPGs might start finding themselves skipping over the GM section of a core rulebook because they start feeling like they've seen all the advice and explanations a million times. And they're kind of right, except when they're not. Occasionally an RPG will just come out of left field with really interesting advice and mindsets to running a game. In this video, I want to run you through 3 of the most incredible GM sections that I've come across in recent months. There's no way for me to cover all of the good stuff in each of these chapters, but I do want to highlight some of my favorite aspects so that if you are aspiring to be a better GM yourself, you might consider picking up the book or PDF yourself and giving each of these a full read. The Walking Dead is a zombie survival game by Free League. As you can see from the cover, it's very much an officially licensed product. I actually released a whole video worrying about this game before it came out, theorizing that maybe Free League had lost their way and was just resigned to pumping out licensed game schluff. But when the game did officially come out, I gave it an earnest read and was blown away by the attention to the unique game design elements that really do simulate a very deadly and unpredictable type of zombie apocalypse as depicted in the Walking Dead comics and TV shows. There were 2 quite interesting takeaways I had for this game. One, you don't have to associate it with The Walking Dead at all if you don't want to. It stands alone as a generic zombie apocalypse RPG as well. And 2, the GM section is unusually good. If you look at the core concepts here, they seem pretty simple and intuitive. Write down issues that players might face or have started to face in the fiction, list out potential challenges for players, and write out some potential consequences for how a challenge gets resolved. Then outline a number of NPCs by defining their own issues, relationships, and key relationships. There's a whole bevy of questions that can help you shape each NPC. You also want to create 1 to 3 factions, which come with a more definitive list of questions to answer, as well as a good number of tables that actually answer those questions with a quick roll of the dice. But here's my favorite part. Actually, it's 2 favorite parts. The first is if you don't feel that your list of challenges is enough, you can add 1 or 2 secret issues that the PCs will eventually find out about. This is just a fun way to build in surprise and chances for players to creatively problem solve. Secret issues for a haven or HQ include things like a secret entrance, contaminated food, zombie swarms tucked away somewhere, things you can spring on them in the worst possible moment, or if and when they are clever enough to work it out for themselves. The second thing that really lights my fire here is the guidance on how to write these challenges. First of all, you can make challenges that are associated with different things. There are challenges associated with the haven and ones associated with a faction and with PCs and NPCs. Mix major and minor challenges together into your lists. That way the tempo and energy of the threats and problems remain unpredictable and interesting. Scratch out the ones that don't seem like fun. Just kill your bad ideas before they hatch at the table. Be concrete and simple. Don't get poetic with the list here. It just needs to be easy to read, recall, and deliver at the table. Don't write challenge lists for every last thing in the game. Just focus on a few PCs, NPCs, and elements in the story. And here's the most important part. These are the 3 most important words in the entire book. Don't plan solutions. This is a huge lesson for new GMs, as well as for ones who have played a long time but subscribe to traditional pre-written adventures. The job as the GM is to come up with interesting problems and to let the players have fun hatching solutions. This is especially applicable to a modern day survival horror game where it's not a stretch to ask players to basically put themselves in their PC shoes and think their way out of problems. There's actually more guidance on challenges later in the chapter, how to activate the challenge, how there will eventually be multiple active challenges going on at the same time, how to escalate a challenge if players don't tend to them, and how to leverage supply shortages here and there, even though the game doesn't officially have mechanics for tracking things like ammo or gasoline. The rest of this chapter does its due diligence in terms of delivering great GM advice, but nothing is as impactful as the concept of listing challenges tied to specific people and things and tracking those on a GM sheet. It's as brilliant as it is simple. Cyberpunk Red came out in 2020 and over the years really polarized people. In one camp, you have the folks who have learned the sort of crunchy rules and embraced all the supplements and free monthly releases, and really just chose to adopt this game as their choice for Cyberpunk, warts and all. Then in the other camp, there's this vocal minority online screaming at the tops of the mountains about how broken and unplayable this game is. I've run this game myself, I've reviewed it on this channel. It's probably not my favorite game of all time, but I've got to say, the loud detractors online really overreact about the negative aspects of this game. And one thing that is completely unassailable is the 50-page GM section, which is thorough and unique. The advice packed into the 50 pages of this chapter is pretty dense, and it generally stays quite focused on the cyberpunk genre. But here's where the genius kind of starts. This breakdown for developing story beats. Beats are just points in a plot, and it's a term that you'll encounter a lot in script writing classes. The ultimate goal of drafting out a beat chart or basic session framework is pacing. It says here that one beat should be about 30 minutes of gameplay. And with that in mind, here's where some of the magic happens. There are 10 specific beat examples for a hook that a GM could use. You see these all the time in TV shows, movies, and books. And those sources are, in fact, where the author was inspired for these. Then for the cliffhanger beat, there are 13 examples. Cliffhangers in this context are defined as a contest whose outcome is in doubt up to the very end. I guess in RPG terms, this is an encounter where dice get rolled and characters take damage or potentially lose something valuable. The third kind of beat is development, which is a sort of vague term, which is why there are 29 examples written out for this beat. But the objective for all of them is the same, to move the plot ahead without any physical conflict. The many examples of development beats are huge for inspiring GMs to think outside of combat as the main way to play this game, or any RPG really. It's a perpetual problem created by games like 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons that everybody at the table regards combat as the solution to all problems. The next type of beat is the climax, which culminates into either a final battle, final revelation, or final act, or any combination of the three. And finally, there is the resolution beat, of which there are 9 examples. I think you'd have to play a lot of Cyberpunk Red before you started finding beat examples not listed in this chapter, which is to say, this is a very thorough treatment of what beats are and which ones you can use in a game. One peculiar aspect of this game is how character progression works. Instead of earning experience points and then spending them to improve your character, players earn improvement points to eventually spend, and they earn them through fulfilling a playstyle that everyone has agreed upon prior to playing. Everyone decides beforehand if they are warriors, socializers, explorers, or role players. Then they consult a table at the end of each mission to see if they've played the way that they said they'd play. This system is probably not for everyone, but it does accomplish a couple of things. First, it acknowledges play styles in the first place, which very few RPGs ever do. By merely acknowledging them, everyone at the table becomes more aware of them and can hopefully tailor their own style to be more in sync or at least complementary to everyone else's. The second thing this does is actually codify and enforce people's professed game styles, which is an interesting way to shape the player experience. It's not approaching the experience from the accomplishments of the player characters, but rather through player behavior itself. It's just different and interesting. Mothership was the breakout indie hit of 2021, with Tuesday Night Games raising $1.4 million on Kickstarter. This is not a huge amount of money when stacked up against the constant deluge of D&D 5e products that crowdfund huge sums all year round. But for a scrappy, humble, staple-bound zine RPG that started off as a free download, this was pretty exciting to see. It's a survival horror game that heavily nods to the early Alien films, but is not shackled by the IP or the lore of Alien. The game itself comes as a player's guide that has all the rules, a bestiary with creatively portrayed space anomalies and enemies, a ship design and combat guide, and of course, a game master's guide called the Warden's Operation Manual. The author of this guide, Sean McCoy, told me personally that he had a lot of pride in the work he did for this manual, and after reading through it a couple times, I think he has every right to be. It's a bit of a triumph. Let me show you my favorite aspects. I think the most striking and exciting thing about this GM guide is how it starts you off with a blank notebook and tells you exactly how to prep a session of the game from start to finish, even providing you with a suggested format in the notebook itself. This might seem a bit patronizing to experienced GMs, but to me it felt like a fresh approach, and one that actually walks you through the physical acts that you can take to prep for a game. Step 1 is grab a notebook. write index at the top of page 1 and roster on the last page. Then on page 2, write session 1 prep. For this session, you want to define the scenario type. The booklet has 10 suggestions for scenarios, which will probably cover most sci-fi survival horror situations. And obviously you can combine or modify these to suit your imagination. Where we saw the dozens of story beat details in Cyberpunk Red, here it is distilled down to 5, all based on the horror film genre. The transgression is where the PCs make their initial error, where they incite the horror to come. Omens is the phase where there are hints at the horror to come and where mysteries are introduced for players to solve. Act 3, Manifestation, is where blood starts to get shed and where the horror makes itself known. Act 4, Banishment, is where the GM pits the PCs against the horror in a confrontation. In the particular game of Mothership, this usually means running away or hiding or avoiding combat in any way possible. Act 5, Slumber, is the sort of aftermath phase where things are okay for the time being, but you leave the door open for the horror, or more like it, to return. The game here is distilled into the phrase survive, solve, or save, and each of those is harder than the last. In order to put those words into action, the GM throws obstacles at the players, and there are 5 general categories with examples under each. Note that violent encounters makes up just 1/5 of the total kinds of challenges for players. This is a ratio that I really like to see in RPGs. There is a short but very effective discussion of puzzles, and I love the 6 points here that describe what makes a puzzle good. Force the players to think in interesting new ways, allow for multiple solutions, give feedback on why an attempted solution didn't work. Don't use an unsolved puzzle to roadblock players' progress entirely, hide the best rewards behind the hardest solutions, and offer clear rewards for solving a puzzle. Just generally speaking, this guide knows where a lot of the rubber hits the road when people play Mothership, and that's in solving puzzles, whether it's on an abandoned space colony or derelict starship or ancient alien ruins, so it helps to have these resources. Back on the notebook that we started, the guide says to turn to a new page and put the name of a location at the top, then draw 10 boxes. Each of these boxes represents a location where a scene will take place, and they're connected by any and all conceivable means of getting from one place to another. The key here is that you're not meant to draw a floor plan. It's more like a story roadmap where different important scenes can take place. I really like this approach because it all but eliminates the problem of players searching empty or insignificant places. Time is short and precious, at least for me, and I don't really want to spend time or watch people spend time investigating locations devoid of significance to the story. Here it is in bold. Focus on the important things and let your players' imaginations fill in the details. As a sort of corollary to that principle, it says, only describe the horror a little at a time, never give them the complete picture. This whole concept doesn't just save a lot of time at the table and take a huge verbal and mental load off the GM, it is a more enticing and inclusive way to run RPGs, where the players are trusted to come up with some of the world that their characters exist in, even if privately or silently. Back to our notebook, you can turn to a new page and label it with an overall area, which can be the size of a planet or solar system or multi-star cluster. The principle is the same as the location map. Identify the places that the PCs could go in which a scene of significance could play out. Don't describe every planet and moon in a solar system unless they have an impact on the immediate story. This is world building at its finest, and it's done 2 pages at a time in your notebook. Tracking factions should be simple and straightforward as well. The name of the faction, what business they're in, the important NPCs associated with the faction, and any important locations. Then as a story progresses, you can tick off boxes that track one or more of their goals. If you're familiar with Ironsworn or Starforged by Sean Tompkin, both of which I've reviewed on this channel, then you'll find this goals tracking business very familiar. It's extremely intuitive for GMs. Anytime a faction makes headway towards a goal in the fiction, you mark off a box. When the whole row is filled, the goal is completed and one kind of event or condition or another is triggered. On the right-hand page here, you can track a simple relational map between multiple factions. The final page of a session in your notebook might look like this, where you jot down some basic information about the session: who played, which new NPCs entered the story, the highlights of what happened, and most importantly, after chatting with your players, a short list of what worked best and what didn't work in everyone's opinion. This is a great practice because no GM in the world can read people's minds. You have to listen to player feedback if you want to be the kind of GM that delivers a great ongoing gaming experience. There is so much that I didn't cover in all 3 of these GM sections in this video, in part because I didn't want to make an hour-long video, but also because I hope that you can support these creators yourself by buying the PDF or print version of the book, rather than watching a complete recap of their content. There's so much to learn from these authors in these chapters, or in the case of Mothership in the booklet. One commonality across all of them here is the practicality of the advice. It's clear that these authors have all extensively played their own game. As much as the advice can be applied generally in a lot of cases, the advice is really tailored to the respective game. And you can just tell when GM advice is written from specific experience as opposed to being copy-pasted from the million run-of-the-mill RPG GM sections out there. I'd love to know your thoughts on the GM approaches, tools, and advice covered in this video, and if these authors have inspired you to be a better GM. Links for everything are below. Thanks again for watching. See ya.